Hey guys, today I am showing you how to make a farmhouse style rustic wood sign that looks like it was designed by Joanna Gaines herself. If you want to learn how, keep watching. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new, I'm so glad you're here. My name is Katie Falinger, and on this channel, I show you all sorts of DIY tutorials and ideas, all to make your home your happiest place. So if you're into that, I hope you'll consider subscribing so as not to miss out on any future videos. I've got some really cool stuff planned. So today's video is part one of a two-part tutorial series all about how to make this. The frame, the sign itself, it is all totally from scratch. So this video is going to cover the woodworking portion of this project. So by the end, you're going to know how to make your own frame and also how to make a blank customizable sign. So the finishing and the stenciling portion of this project is going to be covered in another video. Now, as any of you who regularly DIY know, creating is a process of trial and error, and boy, did I learn some things making this project. This final piece is not at all what I originally intended. And I also figured out ways to rig things along the way just so I could get by. So I'm gonna pass on some great tips if this is something that you wanna try your hand at. Okay, so I always like to start with a list of what I used. And I also have a link in the description below with a full shopping list of everything that I did use for this project. And it is a pretty lengthy list this time. But keep in mind that I did rig some of these steps with stuff that I just have laying in my garage. So you might be able to use alternate tools or materials that you already have and get the same result. For the frame, I'm using furring strips. These measure 1 by 2 inches and come in 8-foot long strips. Some tempered hardboard. This piece measures 4 by 4 feet. A chop saw, a work table, synthetic paintbrush, a few sponge brushes like this, stir sticks, plastic gloves, a few lint-free rags or towels, a decorative glaze, chalk paint in a color of your choice, some wood stain, protective finish, a carpenter square, tape measure, safety glasses, safety ear muffs, a can-do clamp, masking tape, 2 pairs of clamps, a yardstick, this will have a few purposes, 2 pieces of scrap wood, a 2x4, some 180 grit sandpaper, a nail gun, staple gun, and a circular saw, power sander, an air compressor, and a jaw stand. So ideally you'd have a pair of sawhorses instead of using a jaw stand, but we always borrow ours from our neighbor and he wasn't home at the time. So this is an example of how I kind of rigged my tool set to work with what I had. But a fun side note, I'm considering doing an upcoming video on how to make your own sawhorses. So let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd be interested in seeing. And also, they weren't pictured in the materials rundown, but you're going to need a pencil, some cardboard, as well as a paper plate for this project. That said, a lot of these materials are things I grab for all the time when I'm working on DIY projects. So I created a DIY must-have checklist. It's a list of 19 items that I always have on hand in my workshop. These are things I constantly keep in stock because I use them so often. So you can grab that through a link below. And no joke, guys, I used 13 of the 19 items on that list for this project, so go check that out. So it may come as a surprise that the main part of this sign isn't actually made from wood. As I mentioned in the materials list, it's actually tempered hardboard, which is way lighter. So for these really big signs, that's very helpful. But once it's painted, it looks great. So I'm going to start by trimming this giant piece of hardboard down. What's crazy is this is half the size it started as. I bought it as a 4 by 8 foot piece, but I actually had them cut it down for me at Lowe's because I wouldn't have been able to even fit it in my car otherwise. But you can tell how lightweight this is. And worth a mention, Lowe's or Home Depot will cut stuff down for you. I could have had them cut my hardboard down completely to the size of my sign, but at the time I was still figuring out how big I wanted it to be, and besides, I wanted to show you this process. Okay, let's cut this down to size. I've placed my hardboard on a work table. It needs to be elevated because I'll be using a circular saw later. Now, I want my sign to be 24 inches wide by 17 inches high. So using a carpenter square, I'm marking 24 inches in, And then I'll mark the same length on the opposite side. I'm basically just cutting this whole board in half to start. Now I'm taking my yardstick and tracing a line with my pencil all the way across the hardboard. Since I'll eventually be using the circular saw to cut this, I want to have a line to follow with it. Next, I need to secure the hardboard to my work table, and to do that, I'm going to use 2 of my clamps and 2 pieces of scrap wood. Now, before I do any clamping, I've got to make sure that the line that I drew is off the table by a couple of inches at least, because I obviously don't want to saw through my table in the process. Okay, the scrap wood goes down first, and then I'll clamp it all together right at the edge of my table. So the hardboard ends up sandwiched between the table and the scrap wood, and I'm twisting the clamp tightly. This really needs to be super secure. So why the scrap wood? Well, basically this is going to keep the clamp from damaging or leaving any marks on my hardboard. So all of that pressure is being applied to the scrap wood, and that's also helping to spread out that tension, so that means my hardboard stays nice. Okay, now I need to prop the other end that's hanging off the end. So this gets a little tricky with a lightweight material that's this big. It's going to be inclined to bend down with gravity. So with the help of my husband, who despises being on camera, trust me, this is a huge deal that he let me put footage of him into this, we set up a jaw stand with a 2x4 to basically create a tabletop for this to stand on. Okay, now I want to secure my yardstick to the hardboard. This is going to act as my guide when I'm sawing. Now the distance between the blade and the edge of the circular saw is 1.5 inches. So I'm going to secure the yardstick 1.5 inches over from the line that I penciled in. And doing this allows me to guide the saw, but still have a line to trace with the actual blade. In other words, the blade will follow the pencil line, and the saw guide will follow my yardstick. And I'm actually going to tape the yardstick down so it doesn't wobble when I go to clamp it. I'm double checking my measurements, and then I'll clamp it all down with the clamp turned outward away from where the saw will eventually be passing by. Okay, what you will notice in the next clip is that the labels that were on the hardboard in the foreground have magically disappeared. And that's because the first time I cut this, I forgot to hit record. However, this is a perfect analogy to what the DIY process is all about. You will make mistakes, and so will I. And wait for it, because there's a pretty decent flub on this project, but that's going to come in part 2 next week. But I'm still going to show it to you because this is how we learn. This is how we master these techniques together. And sometimes it helps to know what not to do. And I will say this project still came out better than I originally envisioned. So I feel like the bigger lesson here is to embrace the flaw. So I want to know, what is the biggest DIY flub that you have made? Aside from the one I made in this project, the one that comes to mind is the time that I repainted an old dresser. It was the first upcycling project that I had ever done, so I was already a little intimidated by it, but I was all ready. I had just brought the can of paint home from Sherwin-Williams. It was all mixed, and I spilled the whole can of coral paint all over my blacktop driveway. I'm pretty sure I cried, but almost every project we attempt can be salvaged when we screw it up. So let everyone know in the comments below what blunders you have made, and we're all going to learn from each other. So now that I've checked that the camera is still on, I've put on some safety glasses and ear protection, and I'm lining up the blade of my circular saw. Now, if you've done it right, the blade should match right up with the line you traced, and the edge of the guide is right up against the yardstick. With the blade just off of the hardboard, I'm going to grab the handle, push the safety button, and with that same hand, pull on the trigger. Then I'm slowly guiding the saw right along the line I traced. Now, my arms aren't long enough to get the saw all the way across, so I'm going to need to stop about 2/3 of the way through, and then I'm going to go in from a perpendicular angle to complete the job. But that also means we need to readjust our makeshift tabletop. So my lovely assistant helped me move the jaw stand and the 2x4 to give me the flattest and smoothest surface possible. And he also helped hold the corner too. So again, it's really tricky with the hardboard because it's going to bend under the weight of the clamps, but these were the tools we had at our disposal, so we made it work. One more note, as soon as I saw completely through and let go of the trigger, I'm going to wait to lift the saw out until the blade has come to a full stop. That eliminates any risk that I'd make any accidental cuts. And now that I have a much more manageable piece to work with, I can make that second cut to chop this down to 17 inches. So I'm using my carpenter square again, measuring in 17 inches from the end on both sides. Next, I'm going to rotate that hardboard so that the shortest end of what I'm going to saw off is hanging off the end of the table. It's much more manageable that way. And then, just like before, I'll clamp down the hardboard with a piece of scrap wood in between. So I'm placing a clamp on each corner of my table and tightening it up really well. I've once more set up the jaw stand and the 2x4 to hold up that hanging end of my hardboard. And then using the carpenter square again, I'm measuring 1.5 inches off my original mark that I made at 17 inches so that I can set up my yardstick guide again. Remember, this is to measure the distance between the actual blade and the guide. So my yardstick is basically acting as the straight edge that I can butt up against with my saw to maintain that straight cut. And then using my second set of clamps, I'm going to secure the yardstick down, again with the clamps facing away from where I'll be cutting so that I don't run into them with my saw. Then I line up my saw right against my guide and follow the line I drew. Woot woot! We made it through what I would call the hardest part of this project, and now it is time to cut those furring strips down to size so that they fit around our hardboard. And I want to do it in a way that the hardboard edge hits the middle of that furring strip for two reasons. One, I obviously have to attach the two pieces, but two, I also don't want that hardboard edge poking out the back of my sign. And you can see that the way I attached the frame, the top and bottom strips overlap these vertical side strips. So the top and bottom strips need to be a little longer, and the side strips need to be a little shorter than the original dimensions of the hardboard. So I ended up measuring these at just shy of 16.5 inches for the short strips and just over 24.25 inches for the longer ones. Okay, now it's time to head to the chop saw. So safety first, I'm wearing my eye and ear protection again. Before I make the cut, I'm going to line up the saw to check everything's in the correct place. And I'll bring the chop saw right down to my pencil markings. And I'll do that 4 times over. Now, one quick tip, in order to get the exact same length on my strips, I like to stack the first strip I cut on top of the next one that's waiting to be cut. That'll ensure that both pieces end up exactly the same size. Cool, all right, let's connect to these babies. So I'm breaking out my air compressor and my nail gun, and I need to connect these two with the cable. So to do that, I'll pull back the outer rim of this gold connector and click it onto the end of the nail gun. The other end connects to the compressor, and with the same technique, I pull back the gold outer rim of the connector and click the cable into place. Next, I'll turn on the compressor. It'll make a lot of noise as the tank fills up, and then when it's ready, it'll go quiet, and that's my signal that I can start nailing. But while I wait, I'm laying out the outline of how I want to attach the furring strips. So this is going to help me visualize how I need to nail this together. So I'm taking my Can-Do clamp. This thing is awesome. And what it does is clamp a perfect right angle. So one strip goes here, one goes here, and as I tighten the clamp, I'll adjust the strips to make sure they stay in place, and I'll use my fingers to feel along the edge whether everything's lined up. Once you're satisfied with it, grab your nail gun, and of course you need to line this up in the direction which the nail's going to attach. So there's no safety button on this, but before it's going to let you pull the trigger, you need to push in this outer plastic piece. So I'm applying pressure to the furring strip and then pulling the trigger to nail it together. I'll put 2 or 3 nails into this. And I'll repeat that process on the opposite corner. Okay, now I'll connect the pieces like a puzzle and set up my Can-Do clamp for the third corner. A helpful tip here is to hold down the heaviest side as you clamp because gravity will pull at that side, so you need to keep it in place or it might be difficult to line up your pieces. Also, you might find that your wood is a little warped, but these furring strips are pretty malleable, so we will be able to straighten this out when we attach them to the hardboard. So now it's time to sand it all down. And since I'm working in my driveway, I'm going to put down some cardboard so that none of that blacktop comes off onto my wood. I have made that mistake in the past. And grabbing my power sander and a 180 grit sandpaper, I'll smooth out every inch of my frame. I'm also going on a slight angle on each edge and corner to ever so slightly round those off. Once everything is nice and smooth, I'll wipe off the excess sawdust with a clean rag, and now I can break out my wood stain. So I'm keeping that cardboard down to use as a makeshift drop cloth here, and the stain I'm using this time is the Minwax Jacobian or Jacobine. I'm unsure of the pronunciation, so if you know, please clue me in the comments, but it's a really nice warm brown. Always make sure that you stir your stain to mix the color thoroughly, and then using a sponge brush, I'll go over the entire frame. Now remember, wood stain lays down very opaque, even with just a little on the brush, so you don't have to be too liberal with this. And the sponge brush works great to get that color in all the nooks and crannies, and I have quite a few of those based on how I attached these strips together. So you can stipple or dab that brush into those cracks to make sure the color seeps all the way down to any spots that are visible. And once I've covered everything, I'll give it a minute or two to sit, and then go in with another lint-free rag and wipe off the excess stain to reveal the grain of the wood. This looks great, and I'll let that sit and dry for a few hours. Now, through the magic of video editing, my stain has dried, and now I'll go back in with a clear finish. This is the Minwax Polycrylic Protective Finish, so don't let this milky looking consistency scare you. This is going to dry totally matte and clear, but you will need to stir it just like you would any other stain. And using a clean sponge brush, spread a layer all over the frame. So I'll let that sit and dry for a solid 24 hours. Now, before I head back into the garage, I'm going to disconnect my nail gun from the compressor. So really quickly to do that, I'll just push back that gold outer rim on the connector piece just like I did to attach the hose. And that will allow the nail gun to pop off. You'll hear a loud burst of air, kind of like when you fill your tires, and then replace the cap on the end of the nail gun. In the meantime, let's head back to our hardboard. So I'm going to paint this with a very non-traditional navy blue color. This is the Folk Art brand chalk paint in nautical blue. And I'm going to shake it up really well, pour a big dollop out onto a paper plate, and then using my synthetic brush, just start painting this on any which way. So I'm going for the aged, rustic look here, so this really need not be perfect. And you see how I'm painting in diagonal, haphazard lines back and forth? I also only need one good thick coat of this and I'll be set. So I can let this sit and dry. When the blue chalk paint has totally dried, I'll go over it with a glaze, and I'm hoping to darken and mute that blue to a deeper tone, but this is also going to give the chalk paint an aged look. This is the Smoked Glaze by Rust-Oleum, and I used this in a recent video on an IKEA shelving unit makeover, which I will link below and right here in the cards. Okay, so make sure you stir this up as well. And using my now clean and dry synthetic brush, I'll spread a thin layer of glaze all over the hardboard. And just like I did with the blue paint, I'm making haphazard strokes every which way to give it a roughed up, sort of weathered effect. And once I've covered the entire board, I'll give it a minute or two and then go in with a clean lint-free rag and wipe off that excess glaze. But you can really see the detail of those strokes too when you look at this closely. And once more, I'll let that sit and dry completely. And once all my stains and finishes and paints and glazes are completely dry, it's time to attach the pieces together. For that, I'll be using my staple gun. So in the same way I attached my nail gun, I'll attach my stapler to the compressor. So I'm sliding back that gold outer rim of the connector and clicking it into place. Now, since I've moved indoors, I'm putting on some ear protection as well. And you can see a lot more easily on the flat workbench here that my frame isn't totally straight. The staple gun should help straighten that out, however. So I'll pick which side of my frame I want to face out, the prettiest side. And I'm going to face that down on the table and then place the painted hardboard face down onto the frame. Remember the way we measured this, the frame sits just off of the hardboard, and that way I'll have something to staple into, but you still won't see any of the hardboard showing off the outer edge of my wood frame. So a quick how-to on the stapler. I have a safety trigger and a main trigger. There's also a little arrow to help me line up exactly where I want my staple to go. So I line up the tool right to the edge, pull that safety, and then fire out a staple with the main trigger. And here's one of those mistakes we were talking about. So I accidentally stapled through just the hardboard up in this one corner. It's barely visible, but I can fix this. I just lightly hammered out the staple and continued on. And later I'll go back with touch-up paint on that one spot. So at this point, I have plenty of staples to hold this together. However, the frame is still a little warped and I can see light actually coming through the cracks. So I'm gonna fill in those gaps with extra staples, and that'll help straighten this all out as well. And here is how it'll look when you're done. Now this is obviously the complete customized project, and I'm going to show you how to make your own custom stencil next week. Now I've touched on stenciling before in other videos, but next week we are taking a deep dive into this process because I know some of you have questions about it. So make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that, and you can also ring the bell to get notified when that and any other new videos go up. I post every single Thursday, and by the way, I would love to hear from you in between uploads. You can either post a comment below this video or catch up with me on any of the other social platforms. I posted all the links to my pages below. But if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with your creator friends. This was a labor of love with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears too, but I really think that it's those projects that we have to salvage that sometimes end up being the ones of which we're most proud. And to that end, just to reiterate, answer me this in the comments. What is your biggest DIY mistake? And also tell everybody how you fixed it. This may turn out to be a totally cathartic exercise for you, but also super helpful for everyone who's watching. Meanwhile, don't forget to grab both the DIY must-have checklist below in the description, and also check out the link to the laundry list of materials I used for this project. I know it's a lot, but you probably already have a handful of these things sitting around. Guys, thanks as always for watching, and I will see you next Thursday. How to make, just hit myself in the face. I do. Well, basically I forgot my train of thought. Sometimes it really helps to this again. Oh, I can see your feet. And once all my stains and you see this? Hi! All right, honey, you can go back and help Daddy. Of the materials I used, because I forgot what I wanted to say.